3 strikes against iron, 2 against oak, a rhythm older than memory, steady as a heartbeat. Cyrus Holt had learned this music before he could walk, taught by hands that would later be sold downriver, separated from him like wheat from chaff. Now, at 32 years old, his hands moved with the precision of a man who understood that perfection was the only language white men respected from black flesh. The workshop stood at the eastern edge of Seven Oaks Plantation, a structure of weathered pine and red clay that smelled perpetually of wood shavings and bourbon. Through the open door, the morning light cut across the James River like a blade, turning the water silver and gold. Virginia in October carried a particular beauty, the kind that made men write poetry while others picked tobacco until their fingers bled. Cyrus didn't write poetry, he built barrels. Morning, boy. The voice came from the doorway, casual as a curse. Cyrus didn't look up from his work. He knew that voice the way a dog knows its master's whistle. Thomas Wickham, owner of Seven Oaks, a man whose family had held dominion over this stretch of the James River since 1710. Wickham was 53, soft around the middle from decades of other people's labor, with hands that had never calloused and eyes that calculated worth in dollars and pounds. "Morning, Master Wickham," Cyrus replied, his voice flat as the plane he drew across a barrel stave. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories." Wickham stepped inside, boots heavy on the packed dirt floor. He wore a waistcoat of deep burgundy, buttons polished to mirrors. Behind him, the sun climbed higher, and with it came the sounds of the plantation waking, the bell that called field hands to work, the distant wail of a child, the crack of a whip that might have been a tree branch or might have been something worse. "Got a special request for you," Wickham said, running his finger along a finished barrel. "Hosting a gathering next week. 7 of us, me, Beaumont, Carver, Delancey, Pritchard, Sutton, and Van Horn, the most successful planters from Charles City County to Henrico. We're celebrating the harvest, and I want something memorable, something that shows them what Seven Oaks produces." Cyrus's hands didn't stop moving. "You want display barrels, sir?" "Exactly." Wickham smiled, the expression of a man who believed he was generous. 7 barrels, your finest work, oak-aged, bourbon-sealed, something beautiful enough to be furniture, strong enough to hold 100 gallons. Can you do it?" "Yes, sir." "Good boy." Wickham dropped a leather pouch on the workbench. Coins clinked inside. "That's for materials. The real payment comes when my guests see what you can do. Make me proud, Cyrus." The master left, and with him went the pretense of courtesy. Alone again, Cyrus set down his tools and stared at his hands. They were strong hands, scarred from splinters and cuts that had healed crooked. Hands that had held his wife before she was sold. Hands that had built cradles for children he'd never see grow old. Hands that would build 7 coffins. The memory came without warning, as memories did. 3 years earlier, summer 1745. Sarah. Her name was Sarah, and she'd had eyes like river stones, smooth, dark, endless. They'd married in the quarters, not with papers or priests, but with broom jumping and promises whispered under quilts. For 2 years, she'd been the only softness in a world made of iron and ash. Then came the debt. Wickham had gambled poorly, lost money to a Charleston merchant, and needed to balance his ledgers. Sarah was young, strong, could work both house and field. She fetched a good price. Cyrus remembered standing in the yard, watching the wagon carry her away. He remembered falling to his knees, and he remembered Wickham's overseer, a cruel man named Pike, laughing as he walked past. "That's the thing about property, boy," Pike had said. "Sometimes you gotta sell what you love to keep what you need." Cyrus hadn't spoken for 3 days after that, but he'd kept working, kept building barrels with hands that shook. And somewhere in the silence, between the hammer's ring and the rasp of the plane, something had crystallized inside him. Not rage, which burns hot and fast, but purpose. which burns cold and forever. Wickham thought he owned Cyrus. Cyrus would teach him differently. He began the work that afternoon. 7 barrels, Wickham had said, the finest work. Cyrus selected white oak from the stacks behind his workshop, wood that had been cut 2 winters ago, dried slowly, cured properly. Oak was the only wood for proper barrel making, its tight grain impervious to leakage, its strength legendary. A good barrel could last 50 years. A great barrel could last a century. These barrels would last 1 night. Cyrus measured twice, cut once. Each stave needed to be precisely shaped, curved just so to form a perfect circle when assembled. The work required mathematics that most free men couldn't manage, geometry that existed in the hands rather than on paper. He'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it from his father, a line of coopers stretching back to Africa, to a time before chains. As he worked, others came and went. Joshua, another enslaved man, stopped by to drop off firewood. He was young, barely 20, with hope still visible in his eyes, a hope that Cyrus recognized as dangerous. "Heard Master Wickham wants something special," Joshua said, stacking logs near the forge. "Always want something special," Cyrus replied. "Must be nice, though." Joshua wiped sweat from his forehead. "Being skilled, Wickham treats you better than most. You got your own workshop, your own time mostly. Some of us in the fields, we don't. Ain't nobody free here, Joshua." Cyrus's voice was gentle but firm. "Skilled just means they use you different, but they still using you." Joshua nodded slowly, then left. Cyrus watched him go, knowing that the boy would spend his life mistaking crumbs for bread, grateful for every moment he wasn't being beaten, never realizing that gratitude was just another chain. The sun moved across the sky. Cyrus shaped staves one after another, his hands moving with the fluidity of water. By evening, he had completed the first barrel's pieces, each stave a work of art, smooth as silk, fitted so precisely that not even air could escape between them. Perfect vessels, perfect traps. Night fell over Seven Oaks like a curtain. In the quarters, enslaved men and women gathered for the evening meal. Cornmeal mush, salt pork if they were lucky, water from the well that tasted of iron. Children played in the dirt, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the exhaustion visible in every adult face. This was the hour when white folks pretended black folks didn't exist, when overseers retired to their cabins and masters to their manor houses, when the plantation belonged, briefly, elusively, to those who actually worked it. Cyrus ate alone in his workshop, as was his habit. He'd never been social, even before Sarah. Words had always felt like wasted breath. But tonight, as he chewed stale bread and watched moonlight paint the James River silver, he felt something stirring in his chest. Not quite hope, not quite peace, purpose. He walked to the riverbank, his feet silent on the grass. The James stretched before him, a highway of water that had carried slave ships and tobacco barges, dreams and bodies, fortunes built on the backs of people who'd never see a coin. The river didn't care. It flowed regardless, patient and eternal. "I ain't forgotten," Cyrus whispered to the water. "I ain't forgotten Sarah, or my daddy, or every child sold away from their mama. I ain't forgotten the names of men who drink from barrels I make while I eat scraps," the river answered, with the sound of current against shore. "7 barrels," Cyrus continued, "7 men, and when it's done, either I'm free or I'm dead, but I won't be property no more." A splash in the distance, a fish jumping or perhaps something larger. Cyrus turned back toward his workshop, where 7 partially built barrels stood like sentinels in the darkness. In his mind, he could already see them finished, could see Wickham and his friends admiring the craftsmanship, running their soft hands over wood that had been shaped by calloused fingers. He could see them stepping inside. The following days blurred together in a symphony of focused labor. Cyrus worked from dawn until darkness, shaping staves, steaming wood, bending it into impossible curves, using heat and patience and ancient techniques. Other enslaved workers passed by, curious about the massive barrels taking shape, each one large enough to hold a man standing upright. "Why so big?" someone asked. "Demonstration pieces," Cyrus replied. "Master wants to impress his friends." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. He reinforced each barrel with iron bands, forged in his own small furnace, hammered with precision until they glowed cherry red and then quenched in water that hissed like a dying breath. The bands would hold. Even against desperate strength, even against men fighting for their lives, the bands would hold. On the fifth day, Thomas Wickham returned with two of his friends, Edward Beaumont and Harrison Carver, planters whose estates bordered Seven Oaks. They were men of similar mold to Wickham, wealthy, entitled, utterly confident in the natural order that placed them at the top, and people like Cyrus at the bottom. "Magnificent!" Beaumont exclaimed, running his hand over a completed barrel. The man was rotund, his face perpetually flushed from drink. "Cyrus, you've outdone yourself. Look at this joinery, Harrison. Perfect, absolutely perfect." Carver, thinner and more severe, nodded approval. "What's the capacity?" "100 gallons each, sir," Cyrus replied. "White oak, charred inside for flavor, sealed with pitch. These'll hold bourbon for decades without a drop of leakage. And big enough for a man to step inside," Wickham added proudly, as if he'd built them himself. "I thought we might do something special at the gathering. Let each of you step into a barrel, breathe in the aroma of aging bourbon, create a memorable experience." The three men laughed, delighted by the novelty. Cyrus kept his face neutral, his eyes down, the perfect image of obedient labor. "Will they be ready by Saturday?" Wickham asked. "Yes, sir. All 7. "Excellent." Wickham clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture meant to convey camaraderie but which felt like a brand. "You're a credit to Seven Oaks, Cyrus, a true craftsman." After they left, Cyrus stood alone among his barrels and allowed himself a smile. Not of joy, but of inevitability. The pieces were moving into place like staves around a circle, coming together in perfect, terrible symmetry. Saturday was 3 days away. On Friday evening, Cyrus made his final preparations. He'd spent the day finishing the 7th barrel, ensuring every detail was flawless. Now, as twilight painted the workshop in shades of amber and shadow, he stood back and examined his work. 7 barrels stood in a row, each one a masterpiece of cooper's craft. They were beautiful objects, the kind that would be displayed in manor houses, admired by generations. They were also tombs. Cyrus had modified each barrel subtly, invisibly. The lids, massive circular pieces of oak, had been fitted with internal catches that could only be opened from outside. Once closed, they would seal completely, airtight. The breathing holes he'd originally planned had been covered with plugs that looked decorative but served a darker purpose. A man trapped inside would have perhaps 10 minutes of air, maybe 15 if he controlled his panic. They wouldn't control their panic. He'd also prepared 7 measures of bourbon, each aged in smaller barrels, each carrying a scent strong enough to justify asking the plantation owners to step inside and experience it fully. The invitation would seem eccentric, but harmless. Wealthy men often indulged in such theatrical experiences. They would step inside willingly. That was the beauty of it. As darkness fell completely, Cyrus walked once more to the riverbank. The James flowed past, eternal and indifferent. Tomorrow night it would carry 7 barrels downstream. Tomorrow night the water would claim the men who'd claimed so many others. "Sarah," he whispered to the wind, "I ain't forgot. I'm making it right. Whatever comes after, I'm making it right." Behind him, in the workshop, 7 barrels waited like promises about to be kept. The moon rose full and pale, casting everything in silver light. Somewhere in the quarters, someone was singing, a low, mournful hymn about crossing rivers and going home. Cyrus listened until the song faded, then returned to his workshop. He picked up his hammer, felt its familiar weight, and set it beside the Bible he'd kept hidden beneath his workbench. The book had belonged to his father, passed down through hands that couldn't read, but understood that some words carried power beyond meaning. He opened it at random, his finger falling on a passage in Romans. The words swam before his eyes in the lamplight, but one phrase stood clear: "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." "Tomorrow," Cyrus said to the empty room, "tomorrow we find out if the Lord needs help with his vengeance." The hammer rested on the bench, silent now, waiting for its final song. Outside, the river flowed toward the sea, patient as time, ready to receive whatever offerings the night might bring. 7 barrels, 7 men, one cooper who refused to die a slave. The story had begun. The morning of October 14th, 1748, arrived with fog so thick it turned Seven Oaks Plantation into a ghost of itself. Cyrus woke before dawn, as he always did, but this morning felt different. The air carried a weight, a pressure against his chest that might have been fear or anticipation or something older than both. He dressed in the darkness of his small cabin behind the workshop, a single room with a dirt floor, a straw mattress, and walls thin enough that he could hear the river whispering through the mist. Today was the day. He walked to the workshop as the first grey light bled through the fog. The 7 barrels stood exactly where he'd left them, arranged in a semicircle like judges waiting to pass sentence. Each one gleamed with the oil he'd rubbed into the wood, making the grains shimmer like water. They were the finest work he'd ever produced, and they would be the last. Cyrus ran his hand along the nearest barrel, feeling the perfect smoothness of the staves, the cold strength of the iron bands. A masterpiece, 7 masterpieces. Thomas Wickham would be proud, right up until the moment he understood what pride had cost him. "Lord," Cyrus whispered, "I ain't asking for forgiveness. I know what I'm doing, and I know what it means. I'm just asking that when this is done, somebody remembers Sarah, remembers all of us who died without names. That's all." The fog didn't answer, but the river did, its voice a constant murmur that sounded almost like approval. By mid-morning, the plantation was alive with activity. Enslaved workers moved through the grounds like shadows, preparing for the evening's gathering. In the manor house, Wickham's wife supervised the preparation of food: roasted pig, cornbread, preserves made from summer berries. The dining room was decorated with autumn leaves and candles, transformed into a space worthy of Virginia's planter aristocracy. In the quarters, the mood was different. Everyone knew that when masters celebrated, enslaved people suffered. Celebrations meant extra work, heightened scrutiny, punishments for the smallest infractions. And when wealthy white men gathered together, their cruelty seemed to multiply, each trying to outdo the others in displays of dominance. Joshua found Cyrus in the workshop around noon, bringing a plate of food, cornbread, and a piece of pork that had been meant for the evening, but which the kitchen workers had managed to spare. "Thought you might be hungry," Joshua said, setting the plate down. "Big night, they saying. 7 of the richest men in Virginia, all here at once." Cyrus accepted the food with a nod. "Appreciate it." Joshua lingered, his young face troubled. "You seem different today, quiet, even for you." "Just focused on the work." "These barrels." Joshua walked around one, examining it with genuine admiration. "Never seen anything like them. Master Wickham's going to be showing you off like a prize horse tonight." "Probably. Don't seem to bother you none." Cyrus looked up from his food, met Joshua's eyes. For a moment he considered telling the young man everything, warning him to stay far away from the workshop tonight to make sure others did the same. But that would raise questions, and questions led to discovery. "Joshua," Cyrus said carefully, "whatever happens tonight, you stay in the quarters. Hear me? Don't come near the workshop. Don't come looking for me. Just stay put." Joshua frowned. "What you mean, whatever happens?" "Just do like I say." The young man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Cyrus, all right." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You a good man. Whatever folks say about you being cold, I know better. You a good man." After Joshua left, Cyrus sat alone with his food, though he found he had no appetite. A good man. He wondered if good men drowned other men in barrels, if justice and murder could occupy the same space, if God would judge him for taking vengeance that the law would never deliver. He supposed he'd find out soon enough. The guests began arriving at 4 o'clock, as the autumn sun started its descent toward the horizon. Cyrus watched from his workshop as they came, these titans of Virginia society, each arriving in a carriage finer than any home most people would ever own. Edward Beaumont arrived first, his bulk requiring assistance to dismount. Harrison Carver came next, his thin face severe as a hanging judge. Then came Vincent Delancey, Robert Pritchard, Malcolm Sutton, and finally Abraham Van Horn. 7 men whose combined wealth represented thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved people, fortunes built on tobacco and human suffering. Thomas Wickham greeted each one like a king receiving vassals, all smiles and firm handshakes, already half drunk on his own importance. The men disappeared into the manor house, where servants, all enslaved, all invisible, would attend to their every need. Cyrus had met all 7 men before, in the way that property meets its owners. They'd come to the workshop at various times to commission barrels, inspect work, pass judgment on his craft. Some had been casually cruel, others indifferently dismissive. None had ever looked at him and seen a human being. Tonight, that would change. At 6 o'clock, as planned, Thomas Wickham emerged from the manor house with his guests, all of them ruddy-faced from wine and rich food. They wore their finest, waistcoats of silk, breeches of velvet, stockings white as innocence they'd never possessed. They laughed as they walked toward the workshop, their voices carrying across the grounds. Cyrus stood in the doorway waiting. "Gentlemen," Wickham announced, spreading his arms wide, "I present to you the finest cooper in Virginia, my Cyrus and his masterworks." The 7 men entered the workshop, and Cyrus watched their faces transform with genuine appreciation. Whatever else they were, they understood craftsmanship. They circled the barrels like children at Christmas, running their hands over the wood, testing the strength of the iron bands, exclaiming over the precision of the joinery. "Remarkable," Van Horn breathed. He was the oldest of the group, nearly 60, with white hair and hands that trembled slightly. "Simply remarkable. Wickham, you weren't exaggerating. Each one," Wickham explained proudly, "can hold 100 gallons. White oak, charred inside, sealed perfectly. But here's the truly special part." He walked to the nearest barrel and knocked on its side. "They're large enough for a man to step inside. I thought we might try something unique. Each of you can enter a barrel, breathe in the aroma of aging bourbon, experience the craft from the inside." The men laughed, delighted by the novelty. "Theatrical," Carver said, but he was smiling. "Very theatrical." "Why not?" Pritchard added. He was the youngest of the group, barely 40, with an appetite for novelty that had made him wealthy through risky investments. "When else will we have the opportunity?" Cyrus had prepared 7 small glasses of bourbon, aged 3 years, each one representing the barrel's potential. He offered them now, his hands steady, his face a mask of servile humility. "If the gentleman would care to taste," he said softly, "this is what each barrel will produce." But Master Wickham is right. The full experience requires stepping inside, letting the wood speak to you. Beaumont drained his glass in one swallow. "By God, that's smooth. Yes, let's do it. Let's all try it." One by one, they agreed. The wine and the bourbon and their own sense of invulnerability made them reckless. These were men who'd spent their lives being obeyed, never questioned, never challenged. The idea of entering a barrel struck them as eccentric, memorable, exactly the sort of story they'd tell at future gatherings. "Who's first?" Wickham asked. "I'll volunteer," Van Horn said. The old man approached the nearest barrel, peering inside. "How do I—" "There's a step stool here, sir," Cyrus said, positioning it. "Just climb up, step over the edge, and stand inside. The barrel's tall enough that you'll be comfortable. I'll hand you a candle so you can see the charring on the interior walls." Van Horn climbed into the barrel with surprising agility for his age. He stood inside, his head and shoulders visible above the rim, and inhaled deeply. "Extraordinary," he called out. "The aroma is intense, like standing inside a forest made of whiskey." The others laughed. Van Horn reached for the candle Cyrus offered, but as he did, Cyrus placed the heavy oak lid against the barrel's opening. "Sir, if you'll duck down for just a moment, I'll show you how the lid seals. It creates a microclimate that enhances the aging process." Van Horn, trusting, curious, ducked down. Cyrus slammed the lid shut. The sound echoed through the workshop like a gunshot. Before anyone could react, Cyrus had thrown the external latch, sealing Van Horn inside. The old man's shout was immediately muffled, transformed into a barely audible thumping against wood. "What the hell?" Pritchard started forward, but Cyrus had already moved to the next barrel. "Gentlemen," Cyrus said, his voice calm as Sunday morning, "I invite you to join him." For a moment, they stood frozen, 6 wealthy men trying to process what their eyes were telling them, but their minds couldn't accept. A slave had just trapped one of their own. It was impossible. It violated every law of nature and society they understood. Harrison Carver was the first to recover. "Have you lost your mind? Release him immediately." Instead, Cyrus picked up his hammer. The tool felt perfect in his hand, weighted correctly, balanced like an extension of his arm. He'd used it 10,000 times to build, to create, to craft beauty from raw wood. Now he would use it for something different. "I built these barrels for you," Cyrus said. 7 barrels, 7 men. You're going to get inside them, one way or another." Beaumont lunged forward, his bulk making him slow. Cyrus sidestepped and brought the hammer down on the man's shoulder. The crack of bone was audible, even over Van Horn's muffled screaming. Beaumont collapsed, howling. The others scattered like birds, but the workshop had only one door, and Cyrus stood between them and freedom. Wickham ran for the window, but Cyrus caught him by the collar and slammed him against the nearest barrel with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. "You sold my wife," Cyrus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You sold her because you lost money gambling. Do you even remember her name?" Wickham's eyes were wide with terror. "Cyrus, please!" "Her name was Sarah." Cyrus struck him across the face with the hammer's handle, not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to break teeth. Wickham crumpled. The next minutes were chaos and violence, but Cyrus moved through it with the efficiency of a craftsman completing a familiar task. Delancey tried to fight and received a hammer blow to the knee that shattered his kneecap. Sutton begged and was shown the same mercy he'd shown the families he'd torn apart. None. Carver almost made it to the door before Cyrus dragged him back, the thin man's struggles as ineffective as a child's. Pritchard, the youngest, tried to reason. "Cyrus, listen. Whatever Wickham did, we can make it right. I'll buy your freedom. I'll find your wife. Name your price." Cyrus looked at him. "You think everything has a price?" "Everything does." "Then here's mine." Cyrus grabbed Pritchard by the throat. "Get in the barrel." One by one he forced them inside. Some he had to beat unconscious first. Others went in fighting, their fists pounding uselessly against oak that had been shaped to withstand far greater pressures. Beaumont, his shoulder broken, wept as Cyrus lifted him. Carver spat curses that turned to screams when the lid came down. Thomas Wickham went in last, conscious enough to understand what was happening, but too broken to resist. As Cyrus positioned him over the barrel's opening, Wickham grabbed his arm. "Please," the master whispered through ruined lips. "I have children. I have a wife." "So did I," Cyrus replied and dropped him inside. 7 lids sealed, 7 latches locked, 7 sets of fists hammering against oak that would not yield. Cyrus stood in the center of his workshop, surrounded by the barrels, his chest heaving. His hands were bloody from where he'd split his knuckles hitting flesh and bone. His clothes were torn, but he felt more alive than he had in 3 years. The barrels rocked slightly as their occupants struggled. The sounds coming from inside were terrible, screaming, begging, the thud of bodies throwing themselves against unyielding wood. But the sounds grew fainter as the air inside ran out. 10 minutes, Cyrus had estimated, maybe 15. He checked his timepiece, a battered pocket watch he'd been given by his father, 6:45. The gathering had been scheduled to last until 9. That gave him 2 hours before anyone came looking. More than enough time. He walked outside into the gathering dusk. The fog had lifted, leaving the evening clear and cold. The James River reflected the last light of day, turning its surface gold and crimson. Beautiful, in the way that endings often are. Cyrus returned to the workshop and began the hardest work of the night, moving 7 barrels, each containing a man, from the workshop to the riverbank. They were heavy, impossibly heavy, but he'd built a rolling platform for exactly this purpose. One by one, he levered each barrel onto the platform and pushed it down the gentle slope toward the water. The barrels had stopped rocking by the time he moved the first one. The sounds from inside had ceased. It took him 90 minutes to move all 7 barrels to the river's edge. He lined them up like soldiers at attention, facing the water. The moon had risen full and pale, turning everything silver. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. In the quarters, someone was singing. Cyrus stood before the 7 barrels, his chest heaving from exertion. "You took everything from me," he said to them. "My wife, my freedom, my humanity. You drank whiskey from barrels I made while I ate scraps. You laughed while we suffered. You built your fortunes on our backs and called it God's will." He placed his hand on the nearest barrel, Van Horn's, though it no longer mattered whose was whose. "The river's been carrying our pain for 100 years. Tonight, it carries yours." One by one, he rolled them into the James. The barrels floated for a moment, buoyant despite their terrible cargo, bobbing in the current like massive corks. Then the river caught them, pulled them toward the center channel, and began carrying them downstream. 7 barrels drifting in the moonlight, moving steadily toward the sea. Cyrus watched until they disappeared around a bend, swallowed by darkness and distance. He returned to the workshop and set about cleaning. Blood needed to be scrubbed away. Evidence needed to be hidden. He worked methodically, with the same precision he brought to barrel-making, until no trace remained of what had happened here except 7 empty spaces where masterpieces had stood. Then he collected his few possessions: the Bible, his father's watch, a small leather pouch containing Sarah's hair ribbon, the only piece of her he had left. He changed into his only other set of clothes, worn but clean. At 8:30, he walked to the quarters. Joshua saw him first. "Cyrus, what happened to your hands?" "Cut them working," Cyrus said. "Listen, in about 30 minutes, maybe less, they're going to discover the masters are missing. There's going to be chaos, searches, questions. You need to tell them I left, headed north. Couldn't take being here anymore." "What are you talking about?" "Just do it, Joshua. When they ask, and they will, you tell them I ran. Understand?" The young man's eyes widened with understanding. "Oh, God. What did you do?" "What needed doing?" Cyrus gripped his shoulder. "You're young. You got hope still. Hold on to that. Things are going to change someday. Maybe not in our lifetime, but someday." Before Joshua could respond, Cyrus walked away into the darkness beyond the quarters. He followed paths he knew by heart, moving through woods and fields with the confidence of someone who'd lived there all his life. Behind him, lights began appearing in the manor house as servants discovered the master's absence. Shouts rose into the night. But Cyrus was already gone. He walked through the night, putting distance between himself and Seven Oaks. Not north, as he'd told Joshua to say, but west, toward the mountains. North meant slave catchers and patrols. West meant wilderness, Indian territory, places where a black man might disappear into the landscape and never be found. As dawn broke on October 15th, Cyrus stood on a hillside overlooking the James River Valley. Somewhere downstream, 7 barrels drifted toward the sea. Somewhere behind him, Seven Oaks Plantation was in chaos, the absence of 7 powerful men causing ripples that would spread across Virginia. They would search for him. They would offer rewards. But they would never find him, because Cyrus the Cooper, the obedient slave, the master craftsman, the man they'd thought they owned, had never really existed. He was just a ghost story now, a legend about a man who refused to die enslaved. The discovery came at precisely 9:15 on the evening of October 14th, when Margaret Wickham sent her housemaid, a woman named Patience, to fetch the gentleman from the workshop. Patience found the door open, the lamps burning, and the space empty. 7 distinct impressions in the dirt floor showed where barrels had stood, but the barrels themselves were gone. More troubling were the dark stains on the workbench, the splintered wood near the window, and the copper smell that hung in the air like a question mark. She ran back to the manor house, her skirts lifted high, her voice shrill with alarm. Within minutes, the plantation exploded into controlled chaos. Margaret Wickham, a steel-spined woman who'd managed Seven Oaks during her husband's frequent absences, took command with military efficiency. She sent riders to the neighboring plantations, summoned the county sheriff, and organized search parties from the enslaved workers and overseers. By 10 o'clock, lanterns bobbed through the darkness like fireflies as men searched every building, every field, every shadowed corner of Seven Oaks. They found nothing. 7 of Virginia's wealthiest planters had simply vanished along with the cooper who'd been working for them. The conclusion seemed obvious. "The slave killed them," declared James Pike, the head overseer. He stood in Wickham's study, his face red with fury and something that might have been fear. Had to be. Killed them all and run north. Margaret Wickham sat behind her husband's desk, her face carved from marble. 7 men? You think one slave killed 7 grown men? He's a big man, strong from all that work, and he had the surprise. They wouldn't have suspected nothing from him. Pike slammed his fist on the desk. "We need to form a hunting party. Get the dogs. Track him down before..." "Before what, Mr. Pike?" Margaret's voice could have frozen the James River. "Before he reaches Pennsylvania? Maryland? He's had hours. If Cyrus ran, he could be 20 miles away by now." "Then we'll ride 20 miles and leave the plantation unguarded. Leave all the other slaves unsupervised." She shook her head. "No. We send word to every county between here and the northern border. We offer a reward, but we don't abandon Seven Oaks in some misguided hunt." Sheriff William Bradshaw arrived shortly before midnight, a grizzled man in his 50s who'd seen enough trouble to know when something didn't fit. He examined the workshop by lamplight, noting the bloodstains, the empty spaces, the complete absence of bodies or barrels. "Where's the cooper sleep?" he asked. They showed him Cyrus's cabin. It was bare except for a straw mattress, a single wooden stool, and a small table. No personal effects, no signs of hasty packing, nothing except cleanliness that suggested someone had scrubbed the space clean of identity. Bradshaw stood in the doorway, thinking. "Mrs. Wickham, your husband commissioned any special work recently?" 7 barrels, display pieces for tonight's gathering." "Big barrels?" "Very large." He said they were masterworks. The sheriff walked back to the workshop, examining the impressions in the dirt. He crouched down, measuring with his hands, calculating weight and dimension. When he stood, his face was grim. "Big enough to hold a man," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. "You think—" Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. "I think," Bradshaw said carefully, "that we need to search the river." They began at dawn, as fog rolled off the James River like smoke from a dying fire. Bradshaw organized the search with systematic precision. He divided the riverbank into sections, assigning teams to walk the shore from Seven Oaks downstream for 20 miles. He also sent riders ahead to plantations and towns further down the river, warning them to watch for barrels, bodies, or any sign of the missing men. Margaret Wickham stood on the manor house balcony, watching the search unfold. She'd been awake all night, her her mind refusing to accept what logic suggested. Thomas might be cruel, might be careless with lives that weren't his own, but he was her husband, the father of her 3 children. A man who'd built Seven Oaks into one of Virginia's premier plantations. He couldn't simply be gone. But as the sun climbed higher and the search parties returned empty-handed, that certainty began to crack. No bodies, no barrels, no sign that 7 men had ever existed beyond the abandoned carriages in the stable yard and the half-eaten meal in the dining room. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. In the quarters, a different conversation was unfolding. The enslaved workers of Seven Oaks gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices, their faces carefully neutral. They'd been questioned repeatedly through the night. Where was Cyrus? What had he said? Had he seemed strange or violent? Did anyone know his plans? Joshua had told them what Cyrus asked him to say, that the Cooper had run north, couldn't bear Seven Oaks anymore, had fled without explanation. It was plausible. Slaves ran regularly, driven by desperation or hope or simple human refusal to accept bondage. Most were caught, returned, punished brutally. Some disappeared into the landscape, their fates unknown. But the workers knew something the white folks didn't. They knew Cyrus, knew he wasn't impulsive, wasn't reckless. If Cyrus had done something, he'd planned it carefully, and if he'd planned it carefully, there was a reason. "You think he really killed them?" a woman named Ruth whispered. She was old, perhaps 60, her back bent from decades in the tobacco fields. "Don't know," Joshua replied. "But if he did..." "If he did," Ruth finished, "then maybe God ain't as patient as the preachers claim." The sentiment rippled through the quarters like wind through wheat. Not celebration, that would be dangerous and dishonest, but something close to satisfaction, a sense that somewhere, somehow, balance had been restored to a universe that had tilted too far toward injustice for too long. 7 white men were missing. 1 black man was free. The mathematics felt right. The barrels were discovered on October 16th, 2 days after the gathering. A fisherman named Tobias Green found the first one lodged against a fallen tree 15 miles downstream from Seven Oaks, near the town of Berkeley 100. The barrel bobbed in the shallow water, its oak still gleaming despite 2 days of submersion. Green initially thought he'd stumbled onto salvage, a valuable barrel lost from some careless boat. But when he tried to move it, the weight was wrong, too heavy, too centered. He fetched tools from his boat and pried open the lid. Abraham Van Horn's corpse stared back at him, eyes wide and bloodshot, face purple, hands bloody from clawing at the inside of the barrel. The old man had died badly, suffocating in darkness, his final moments a horror that Green would remember until his own death decades later. The fisherman vomited, then ran for the sheriff. By evening, they'd recovered 4 more barrels, each containing a similar nightmare: Edward Beaumont, Vincent Delancey, Malcolm Sutton, Harrison Carver, all dead. All bearing the marks of violent suffocation, burst blood vessels, torn fingernails, expressions of ultimate terror frozen on their faces. 2 barrels remained missing, presumably carried further downriver by the current, but there was no doubt about what they contained. Sheriff Bradshaw stood on the riverbank, staring at the barrels arranged in a row. Around him, men muttered prayers and curses in equal measure. The brutality of the deaths was shocking enough, but the planning, the precision, the cold calculation required to trap 7 men this way, it spoke to something that terrified them more than simple murder. It spoke to intelligence, to capability, to the possibility that the people they'd enslaved weren't quite as powerless as they'd believed. "Form a hunting party," Bradshaw ordered. "Every able man. We track that slave to the gates of hell if necessary." But even as he said it, he knew it was futile. Cyrus had 2 days' head start, and the trail was cold. More importantly, Bradshaw suspected that Cyrus was far smarter than anyone had given him credit for. A man capable of this wasn't going to be caught by dogs and amateur trackers. They would search anyway, because the alternative was admitting that a slave had murdered 7 of Virginia's elite and escaped to freedom. That admission would shake the foundations of everything they'd built. The news spread across Virginia like wildfire through dry grass. By October 20th, every plantation, every town, every crossroads tavern was discussing the Seven Oaks massacre. The details grew more lurid with each retelling. Some said Cyrus had been a conjure man who'd cursed the barrels. Others claimed he'd had accomplices, that it was the beginning of a slave uprising. A few whispered that the dead men had deserved their fate. Though these whispers were quickly silenced, rewards were posted. $500 for Cyrus Holt, dead or alive. Descriptions circulated. A large black man, skilled cooper, approximately 32 years old, scarred hands, last seen wearing homespun clothing. Patrols intensified along every road heading north. Sheriffs in Pennsylvania and Maryland were notified. But Cyrus remained a ghost. Margaret Wickham buried her husband on October 22nd in the family cemetery overlooking the James River. The funeral was attended by hundreds, planters, merchants, politicians, all of them drawn by obligation and morbid curiosity. 5 other funerals occurred simultaneously across the county as the other victims were laid to rest. The 7th barrel, containing Robert Pritchard, was recovered 3 days later near Richmond, having traveled 40 miles downriver. His funeral was the grandest of all, his family's wealth translating into elaborate mourning rites that felt more like political theater than grief. Through it all, the question hung in the air like smoke. How could one slave do this? The answer, when people dared speak it aloud, was simple and terrifying, because we trained him to. We taught him precision, rewarded his intelligence, gave him tools and freedom of movement that other slaves didn't have. We created a master craftsman and never considered that he might turn his mastery against us. We thought his chains were invisible. We were wrong. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colony's legislative body, emergency sessions were convened. Representatives stood and made impassioned speeches about security, about the need for stricter controls on enslaved workers, about limiting the skills that slaves could learn. "We cannot," thundered a representative from Henrico County, "continue to train slaves in crafts that give them independence and capability. This cooper was given too much freedom, too much autonomy. He had his own workshop, his own tools, his own time. Is it any wonder he turned those privileges against his betters?" Others disagreed. Should we then return to a purely agricultural slavery? Abandon all the skilled trades that have made Virginia prosperous? Our slaves are blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, weavers. Without their skills, our economy collapses. The debate raged for weeks, ultimately resulting in new laws that required closer supervision of enslaved craftsmen, limits on their movement, and harsher penalties for any hint of rebellion or violence. But everyone knew these laws were theatrical, designed to soothe white fears rather than address the fundamental instability of a society built on human bondage. You couldn't legislate away what Cyrus had proven, that slavery's power was an illusion, maintained only through constant violence and the enslaved people's unwillingness to sacrifice everything for freedom. Cyrus had been willing to sacrifice everything. That made him more dangerous than any law could contain. On November 1st, 3 weeks after the massacre, Joshua was summoned to the manor house. He walked with his heart hammering, certain that somehow, despite his careful lies, they'd connected him to Cyrus's escape. But when he entered the study, he found only Margaret Wickham, sitting behind the desk that had been her husband's, looking older than her 40 years. "Sit," she commanded. Joshua sat. Margaret studied him for a long moment. "You were one of the last people to speak with Cyrus before he disappeared. I want the truth. Did he tell you what he was planning?" No, ma'am. Did he seem angry? Violent? He seemed like he always seemed, quiet, focused on his work. You're lying. Margaret's voice was tired rather than angry. I can see it in your face, but I don't particularly care. Cyrus is gone, my husband is dead, and the truth won't resurrect either of them. She opened a drawer and removed a leather pouch. Seven Oaks needs a new cooper. The tobacco still needs barrels. The whiskey still needs aging. You're young, but Cyrus spoke well of your potential. The position is yours if you want it. Joshua stared at the pouch. Payment for taking the position, a gesture meant to seem generous, but which was really just another form of control. And if I refuse? He asked quietly. Margaret's smile was colder than January. Then you go to the fields, your choice. It wasn't a choice, and they both knew it. Joshua took the pouch. That night, alone in what had been Cyrus's workshop, Joshua found something the searchers had missed. Behind a loose board in the wall, hidden so carefully that only someone who knew where to look would ever find it, was a small carved wooden box. Inside the box, a lock of dark hair tied with ribbon. Sarah's hair, Joshua realized, a marriage certificate written in Cyrus's careful hand, legally meaningless but emotionally profound, and a note. The note was short, written in the same precise hand. To whoever finds this, I ain't sorry for what I'd done. 7 men profited from pain they never had to see. They drank whiskey and ate fine food while we starved. They sold our families for gambling debts and bad investments. They called it commerce. I call it murder. Maybe what I did was murder too. I'll leave that to God to judge. But I want somebody to know I loved my wife. I mourned her loss every day. And when I put those men in barrels and rolled them into the river, I wasn't crazy, wasn't possessed, wasn't less than human. I was more human than they ever let me be. Remember, Sarah. Remember all the names they took from us. Remember that we were people, even when they treated us like tools. And if you're reading this, then maybe you understand. Freedom ain't given. It's taken, or it ain't freedom at all. Cyrus Holt. Joshua read the note 3 times, then carefully replaced it in the box and hid it again. He would leave it there for the next person, and the next, and secret testament passing through the years. Outside, the James River flowed on, patient and eternal, carrying stories it would never tell. Elijah Cross was a man whose profession had made him rich and despised in equal measure. He was a slave catcher, one of the best in Virginia, with a reputation that stretched from the Chesapeake Bay to the Blue Ridge Mountains. For 20 years, he'd tracked runaway slaves through swamps and forests, across rivers and mountains, returning them to their owners with a success rate that bordered on supernatural. He worked with a team of 3 men and 5 dogs, moved like smoke through the wilderness, and had never, in 2 decades, failed to bring back his quarry, until Cyrus Holt. Cross first heard about the Seven Oaks massacre on October 25th, 11 days after the murders. He'd been tracking a different runaway, a woman who'd fled her plantation near Petersburg, when word reached him about the reward. $500 for a cooper who'd killed 7 planters and vanished. $500 was more than Cross made in a year. More importantly, the challenge intrigued him. Most runaways were desperate, panicked, easy to track because fear made them sloppy. But a man who could plan and execute 7 simultaneous murders, then disappear without a trace. That man was different. Cross abandoned his current hunt and rode for Seven Oaks. He arrived on October 27th, finding the plantation still reeling from loss and scandal. Margaret Wickham received him in her study, her assessment of him taking perhaps 3 seconds. She saw what most people saw, a man in his early 40s, weathered from years outdoors, dressed in practical brown leather and homespun. But she also saw the intelligence in his eyes, the calculating way he examined the room, the coiled violence in his posture. "Mrs. Wickham," Cross said, removing his hat, "I'm here about the reward for Cyrus Holt." "You and 20 other bounty hunters." Margaret's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd repeated the same information too many times. Sheriff Bradshaw has already organized search parties. They've found nothing. That's because they're looking in the wrong places. Cross moved to the window, gazing out at the river. May I see where he worked? Margaret led him to the workshop. It had been cleaned since the murders, but Cross read the space like a book written in a language only he understood. He examined the floor, noting the faint depressions where barrels had stood. He studied the workbench, the tools, the forge. He ran his fingers along the walls, searching for hidden compartments or messages. He was here how long? Cross asked. All his life. Born on the plantation. Family. Had a wife. Sarah. Sold 3 years ago to settle a debt. Cross nodded slowly. And nobody thought that might matter. Margaret's silence was answer enough. Cross walked outside, circling the workshop, examining the ground with the intensity of a man reading scripture. He found the path Cyrus had used to roll the barrels to the river, faint wheel marks still visible in the grass. He followed it to the water's edge, then stood looking downstream. He went west, Cross said. The sheriff thinks north. Everyone runs north. Everyone stupid runs north. Cross turned to face her. North means patrols, slave catchers, every constable between here and Pennsylvania watching for runaways. A smart man, and your Cooper was smart. He'd go where nobody's looking. West into the mountains, then maybe northwest toward the Ohio Valley. Territory where a black man might disappear among the Indians, the traders, the people who don't ask questions. Margaret considered this. Will you find him? Yes. How can you be certain? Cross smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression, because I've never failed, Mrs. Wickham. And I don't intend to start with Cyrus Holt. Cross began his hunt on October 28th, starting from Seven Oaks and working outward in a spiral pattern. He traveled with his team, 3 hard men named Dalton, Webb, and Pierce, plus 5 hunting dogs bred specifically for tracking humans. The dogs were massive animals, part mastiff and part bloodhound, trained to follow scent across water through smoke over ground that had been deliberately obscured. But even with the dogs, the trail was cold. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since Cyrus's flight, and autumn rains had washed away much of the evidence. Cross worked methodically, questioning enslaved workers on every plantation, visiting every town and settlement, offering coin for information. Most had nothing useful to share, but on November 2nd, Cross spoke with an old black man named Samuel who lived in a freedmen's settlement near the Appomattox River. Big man, scarred hands, quiet, Samuel repeated Cross's description. Yeah, I seen him. Came through here maybe 2 weeks back, bought some cornmeal and salt pork, paid with coins, which was strange. Most runaways don't have money. Which direction did he go? Samuel pointed west, toward the mountains, told me he was a freeman heading home to Kentucky. I didn't believe him, but I didn't care neither. Man wants to be free. That's between him and God. Cross paid Samuel and continued west. The trail led into the Blue Ridge Mountains, where civilization gave way to wilderness. This was territory that made even experienced hunters nervous. Steep ridges covered in dense forest, valleys where fog settled like lake water, caves that extended for miles into darkness. It was home to Cherokee and Shawnee, to white settlers who'd fled society, to bandits and hermits and people who'd chosen isolation over community. It was perfect hiding ground. Cross pushed his team hard, following signs that most trackers would miss. A broken branch here, a disturbed rock there, the faint impression of a boot in mud. The dogs picked up scent occasionally, always heading west and north, always keeping to high ground where pursuit would be difficult. On November 10th, they found Cyrus's first campsite. It was in a cave overlooking a valley, positioned so that anyone approaching would be visible for miles. The remains of a fire were still present, along with bones from a rabbit and the faint scent that the dogs went mad for. He was here 2 days ago, Cross said, examining the ashes. Maybe 3. He's staying ahead of us, but just barely. We're gaining, Dalton observed. He was the largest of Cross's team, a man whose size disguised surprising speed. "He knows we're following." Cross pointed to the cave's positioning. "Look at this location. Defensible. Good sightlines." "He chose it specifically so he could see us coming." "Then why are we following?" Webb asked. "If he sees us coming, we'll never catch him." Cross smiled. "Because eventually he'll run out of mountains, and when he does, he'll have to choose: go north where the patrols are, or drop into the valleys where we can surround him. Either way, his options narrow." They pushed on, climbing higher into the mountains as October gave way to November and the weather turned cold. Cyrus knew he was being followed. He'd known since November 5th, when he'd spotted the dogs in the distance, their distinctive shapes visible even from miles away. Slave catchers, professional hunters, men who wouldn't quit until he was caught or one of them was dead. He'd expected this, planned for it even. You didn't kill 7 wealthy white men and expect to walk away clean. But planning for pursuit and experiencing it were different things. The knowledge that men and dogs were tracking him, closing the distance slowly but inevitably, added weight to every step. He traveled at night when possible, covering ground in darkness when the dogs couldn't track effectively. During the day, he hid in caves or dense thickets, watching his back trail, calculating distances and times. He was in good shape from years of physical labor, but the mountains were brutal. Food was scarce. The temperature dropped each night. And he was alone, utterly alone, in a way he'd never been even during slavery. On November 12th, he reached a decision point. He stood on a ridge looking north, where the mountains eventually descended into valleys that led toward Pennsylvania and freedom. Behind him, perhaps a day away, the hunters were coming. Ahead, the terrain would become easier, which meant he'd move faster. But so would they. He could try to outrun them, or he could make a stand. Cyrus thought about the 7 barrels, about the precision it had taken to trap 7 men, about the planning and patience and willingness to sacrifice everything for justice. If he ran and they caught him, they'd hang him slowly, make a spectacle of his death, turn him into a warning for every other slave who might think freedom was worth the cost. But if he made a stand, if he faced his pursuers on ground of his choosing, maybe he wouldn't win. Probably he wouldn't win, but at least he'd die as something other than prey. He began looking for the right location. Cross found Cyrus's position on November 14th. The runaway had chosen brilliantly. A narrow ravine with high walls, multiple caves providing cover, a stream offering water. More importantly, the ravine had only 2 entrances, and Cyrus had positioned himself where he could watch both. "He's done running," Cross observed, studying the terrain through a spyglass. "He's going to make us come to him." "We could wait him out," Pierce suggested. "Cold's getting worse, food's scarce. Give it a week, he'll have to move." "A week?" Cross lowered the spyglass. "We've been tracking him for 17 days. Do you really think a man who planned what he planned hasn't stockpiled supplies? He could last a month up here. Then what do you suggest?" Cross was quiet for a long moment, watching the ravine, watching the shadows and angles. "We negotiate." The other men stared at him. "Negotiate?" Dalton's voice carried disbelief. "With a slave, with a killer," Cross corrected. "There's a difference. This isn't some field hand who panicked and ran. This is a man who executed 7 people with precision. That level of planning, that intelligence, you don't capture that with dogs and nets. You capture it by understanding what it wants." "What does he want?" Webb asked. "What every runaway wants. Freedom." Cross stood, making himself visible on the ridge above the ravine. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Cyrus Holt, I'm Elijah Cross, tracker contracted by 7 Oaks Plantation. I know you can hear me, and I know you're watching. I want to talk. No tricks, no traps, just talk." The ravine remained silent. Cross tried again. "You've led us on one hell of a chase, 3 weeks through some of the worst country I've ever tracked. You've got skills, Holt. More importantly, You've got courage. Most men couldn't have done what you did. Most men couldn't have survived this long. I respect that. Still nothing. I'm going to walk down into that ravine, Cross continued. Unarmed, alone. Just to talk. If you want to kill me, that's your choice. But hear me out first. You've earned that much. He handed his rifle to Dalton, removed the knife from his belt, and started down the slope toward the ravine entrance. His men watched him go, certain they were witnessing either genius or suicide. Cyrus watched the tracker descend. He held a rifle he'd taken from an isolated cabin weeks ago, its barrel steady, aimed at the man's center mass. One shot. He could end this right now, kill the lead hunter and scatter the rest. But curiosity held his finger on the trigger guard rather than the trigger itself. The tracker entered the ravine alone, hands raised, moving slowly. He was younger than Cyrus expected, maybe 45, with a lean build and movements that spoke of competence rather than bravado. When he was 20 feet away, he stopped. "That's close enough," Cyrus called from his position behind a boulder. Cross stopped. "Fair enough. Can you hear me from there?" "I can hear you." "Good." Cross lowered his hands slowly, making his movements obvious and non-threatening. "I'm going to be straight with you, Holt. You're caught. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. These mountains end, and when they do, your options narrow. You go north, you hit patrols. You go south, you hit plantations. You go west, you hit Indian territory that's not friendly to any outsider. There's no winning this." "Then I'll die trying," Cyrus replied. "You could. Or you could live." Cyrus laughed, a sound without humor. "Live as a slave. Live long enough to hang for killing 7 white men. That's not living." "Agreed." Cross sat down on a rock, making himself vulnerable. "But there are other options." "Like what?" "Like we make a deal. You and me, right here, right now." "What kind of deal?" Cross leaned forward. "The reward on you is $500. That's a fortune, sure, but it's payable only if I bring you back alive. Dead, you're worth nothing, and bringing you back alive through these mountains with winter coming, knowing you'll fight every step, that's not worth $500 to me." Cyrus kept his rifle steady. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'll let you go. Right now. You disappear into these mountains, head northwest toward the Ohio Valley, like you've been planning. I go back to Seven Oaks, tell them you died falling off a cliff. They'll want proof, so I'll bring a body. Not hard to find a dead runaway these days, and claim it's you. They'll accept it because they want closure. I'll collect whatever portion of the reward they'll pay for a corpse, and you get to be free." "Why would you do that?" Cross was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been tracking runaways for 20 years, Holt. Thousands of people. Most of them were just scared folks trying to survive. But occasionally, I track someone who makes me question what I'm doing. You're that person. What you did was wrong. Murder is murder, but I understand why you did it. And I respect that you had the courage to follow through." Cyrus didn't respond immediately. He was thinking, calculating, looking for the trap. "How do I know you won't just shoot me when I show myself?" "You don't," Cross admitted. "You have to trust me, which is asking a lot, I know. But consider, if I wanted you dead, I could have shot you from the ridge, could have sent my men to surround this ravine, could have waited you out. Instead, I walked in here alone and unarmed. That has to count for something." It did count for something, but Cyrus had learned long ago that trust was a luxury enslaved people couldn't afford. "Let me think," Cyrus said. "Take your time. I'll be here." Cross sat on the rock for nearly an hour, waiting. His men on the ridge must be going insane, but he didn't move. He'd meant what he said. Cyrus Holt had earned respect, even if he'd earned it through murder. Finally, Cyrus emerged from behind the boulder. He was larger than Cross had expected, with shoulders like an ox from years of physical labor. His face was weathered, eyes hard but not cruel. He held the rifle loosely, not quite aimed but ready to shoot if necessary. The two men studied each other across 20 feet of ravine floor. "Why should I believe you?" Cyrus asked. Because I'm giving you the only choice you've got left. You can trust me and maybe live, or you can kill me and definitely die when my men come for vengeance. Those are your options." Cyrus considered this. "If I go with your plan, where do I go?" "Northwest. Follow the valleys toward the Ohio River. There are settlements there, French traders, people who don't care about Virginia's laws. You're skilled. You can make barrels anywhere, work as a cooper, build a life. It won't be easy, but it'll be free." "And what do you get?" "Peace of mind," Cross said, "and the knowledge that for once in my life I did something other than drag people back to hell." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind through the ravine and the distant call of a crow. Finally, Cyrus lowered his rifle. "All right," he said, "we got a deal." They shook hands like equals, which neither of them had expected. Cross gave Cyrus detailed instructions: routes to avoid, settlements to trust, names of traders who might help. He also gave him $20 from his own pocket, enough to buy supplies for the journey ahead. "One more thing," Cross said. "Sarah, your wife. She was sold to a plantation near Charleston, place called Riverside. If you ever get established, ever get enough money, you might be able to buy her freedom." Cyrus's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "I make it my business to know things. Information is worth more than force in my line of work." Cross paused. "I can't promise she's still there, can't promise she's still alive, but it's a lead at least." "Thank you," Cyrus said quietly. "Don't thank me, just disappear. Make sure I never hear about you again." Cross turned and walked back toward the ravine entrance. Behind him, Cyrus called out one more time, "Cross, why'd you really do this?" The tracker stopped but didn't turn around. "Because 20 years of hunting people has taught me something. We're all slaves, Holt. Some of us just got longer chains. You broke yours. Least I can do is not forge them again." He walked out of the ravine and climbed back to where his men waited. "Well," Dalton demanded. "Where is he?" "Dead," Cross lied smoothly. "Fell trying to escape. Bodies at the bottom of a gorge. Impossible to recover. We'll need to find another corpse to bring back, but we'll collect what reward we can." His men grumbled but accepted the explanation. They'd been in the mountains too long, and winter was coming. None of them wanted to spend more time chasing a ghost. As they rode away, Cross looked back once at the ravine. He couldn't see Cyrus, but he knew the cooper was watching. A small nod, acknowledgement between two men who understood that sometimes justice required breaking the law. Then he turned his horse north and rode away from the best tracking job he'd ever abandoned. Sarah Holt learned of her husband's death on November 20th, 1748. She was working in the kitchen of Riverside Plantation when another enslaved woman, Mary, found her with news that had traveled through the underground network of communication that connected enslaved people across Virginia and the Carolinas. "Your man," Mary said quietly, her hands busy with vegetables so the overseer wouldn't suspect conversation. "The cooper from Seven Oaks. Word is he killed 7 plantation owners and ran. They hunted him into the mountains, found him dead." Sarah's knife paused mid-cut. "Dead? That's what they're saying. Tracker named Cross brought back a body. They buried it in a potter's field, didn't even bother with proper identification, just wanted the whole business finished." The knife resumed its work, but Sarah's hands trembled slightly. 3 years. 3 years since she'd been sold away from Seven Oaks, torn from Cyrus's arms and sent to this plantation outside Charleston. 3 years of wondering if he still lived, still remembered, still loved her. Now he was dead, and if the stories were true, he'd died killing the men responsible for their separation. "They saying he was crazy," Mary continued, "that he went mad, trapped 7 men in barrels and drowned them in the James River. Saying it was the work of a devil, not a man. It was the work of a man with nothing left to lose," Sarah whispered. That night, alone in the cabin she shared with 5 other enslaved women, Sarah wept quietly, not just for Cyrus's death, but for the love they'd shared and lost, for the life they'd never have, for the children they'd never raise. She wept for the impossibility of their situation and the terrible justice of his response. But she also felt something else: pride. Her husband had refused to die quietly, had refused to accept the role assigned to him, had struck back against the system that had destroyed them both. 7 men dead, 1 man free, if only in death. It was something. Weeks passed, and the story of Cyrus Holt grew in the telling. In slave quarters across Virginia, the Carolinas and Maryland, people whispered about the cooper who'd built coffins for his masters. Some versions said he'd been helped by conjure magic. Others claimed he'd made a deal with the devil. A few suggested he wasn't really dead, that the tracker had let him go, that he was living free somewhere in the Western Territories. The story changed depending on who told it and who listened, but the core remained constant. An enslaved man had risen up, had taken vengeance, had refused to be owned. The white population heard these whispers and grew nervous. Virginia's House of Burgesses passed stricter laws governing enslaved craftsmen. Plantation owners watched their workers with new suspicion. The memory of 7 wealthy men trapped in barrels haunted their nightmares. But for the enslaved, the story became something else. It became hope in the form of warning. It became proof that the powerful could be vulnerable. It became a reminder that submission was a choice, even when the cost of rebellion was death. Young Joshua at Seven Oaks, now working as the plantation cooper, told the story to his children years later. He told them about Cyrus's precision, his planning, his refusal to accept bondage even when acceptance would have been easier. "Your grandfather knew him," Joshua would say, though this wasn't quite true. Knew him as a man of principle, a man who understood that some things are worth dying for. The story spread beyond Virginia, carried by runaways who'd heard it, by traders who'd witnessed the manhunt, by sailors who'd docked at James River ports. It reached Pennsylvania, where freed blacks discussed it in churches. It reached Canada, where escaped slaves built new lives. It traveled to Africa through the testimonies of captured slave ship crews. Everywhere it went, it changed slightly, but everywhere it went, it carried the same message: resistance is possible. On December 1st, 1748, Margaret Wickham stood at her husband's grave. The cemetery overlooked the James River, the same river that had carried away the 7 barrels, the same river that had been witness to so much suffering and death. Winter had come early this year, stripping the trees bare and turning the water grey as iron. Margaret was 42 years old and alone. Her husband was dead, killed by a man she'd barely noticed. A man who'd worked in their workshop for years without her seeing him as anything more than property. Her children were with relatives in Richmond, where they'd remain until the scandal faded. 7 Oaks Plantation still functioned, the tobacco still grew, the barrels still needed making, the economy of slavery grinding forward regardless of individual tragedies. But something had changed. The certainty was gone. The confidence that their world was fixed and unchangeable had cracked. "Did you know?" Margaret asked the gravestone. "Did you have any idea that the man making your barrels hated you enough to kill you?" The stone offered no answer. "I knew," she continued quietly. "Not specifically, not about Cyrus. But I knew that the people we owned hated us. How could they not? We took everything from them, their freedom, their families, their dignity. We told ourselves it was natural, that God ordained it, that they were somehow less human than us. But I knew. Deep down, I knew." She wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. "Thomas, I'm leaving. Selling 7 Oaks, moving to Richmond, starting over. I can't stay here anymore. Every time I look at the river, I see those barrels. Every time I pass the workshop, I wonder what Joshua is thinking, whether he's planning something similar. I can't live with that fear." A bird called from somewhere in the bare trees, its cry lonely and sharp. "I hope," Margaret said, that wherever Cyrus is, dead or alive, he found what he was looking for, because the price was high. 7 deaths, his own life probably. All for what? Freedom? Revenge? What's the difference? She turned and walked back toward the manor house, leaving her husband's grave to the winter and the wind. Behind her, the James River flowed on, carrying its secrets toward the sea. In the spring of 1749, a man matching Cyrus Holt's description appeared in a French trading post on the Ohio River. He called himself Marcus Freeman, claimed to be a freeman from Pennsylvania, and offered his services as a cooper. The trading post's owner, a French-Canadian named Dubois, was skeptical. Free black men were rare this far west. But the man's skill was undeniable. "You make barrels like this regularly?" Dubois asked, examining a sample. "All my life," Marcus replied. "Where'd you learn?" "My father taught me, and his father taught him. It's what we do." Dubois hired him on the spot. Marcus, if that was his real name, worked at the trading post for 6 months, producing barrels of exceptional quality, keeping to himself, speaking little. He saved his wages carefully, living frugally, planning for something that Dubois couldn't quite figure out. Then, in October 1749, exactly 1 year after the Seven Oaks massacre, Marcus approached Dubois with a question. "There are slave traders who come through here sometimes, right? Men who transport enslaved people down the river." "Occasionally," Dubois replied, suddenly wary. "Why?" "I'm looking for someone. A woman named Sarah, sold to a plantation called Riverside near Charleston 3 years ago. If I could find which traders work that route, maybe I could get word to her." "Word saying what?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Saying that I'm alive, that I haven't forgotten her, that I'm working to buy her freedom." Dubois studied the man before him. He'd heard rumors about a cooper who'd killed plantation owners in Virginia, who'd vanished into the Western Territories. Looking at Marcus's scarred hands, his careful manner, his obvious intelligence, Dubois wondered if he was sheltering a fugitive or a free man. In the end, he decided it didn't matter. "I know some traders," Dubois said. "I'll ask around." The message reached Sarah in November 1749. It came through a complicated chain, from Dubois to a trader, from the trader to a free black sailor, from the sailor to a church in Charleston, from the church to Mary, from Mary to Sarah. By the time it arrived, the words had been simplified to their essence. "Your husband lives. He's working to buy your freedom. Hold on." Sarah read the message. Technically, had Mary read it to her, as she couldn't read herself, 3 times, certain it was a mistake or a cruel joke. Cyrus was dead. The tracker had confirmed it. Everyone said so. But the message included details only Cyrus would know. The ribbon she'd worn in her hair, the song they'd sung at their wedding, the exact location where they'd jumped the broom. "He's alive," Sarah whispered. And for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to hope. Over the next 2 years, Marcus worked harder than any free man should have needed to. He made barrels during the day for Dubois, then took on private commissions in the evenings and weekends. He made barrels for farmers, traders, tavern owners, anyone who would pay. He saved every penny, living on almost nothing, wearing clothes until they fell apart, eating the cheapest food available. Dubois watched this with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You know," he said one evening as Marcus worked by lamplight, "even if you save enough to buy her freedom, there's no guarantee her owner will sell. Some men won't, regardless of price." "Then I'll find another way," Marcus replied. "What other way? You can't just steal her, the penalties." "I built 7 coffins once," Marcus said quietly. "If necessary, I'll build more." Dubois left him alone after that. By October 1751, 3 years after the massacre, Marcus had saved $847, enough to buy the freedom of an enslaved woman in her 30s if her owner was willing to sell. He wrote a letter, or rather, had Dubois write it for him, to the owner of Riverside Plantation, offering to purchase Sarah Holt's freedom. He included the money as a banknote, representing years of labor and sacrifice. Then he waited. The response came in December 1751. The owner of Riverside, a man named Thomas Collington, agreed to the sale. Sarah was 34 years old, past prime working age, and $847 was more than he'd get at auction. He considered it good business. Papers were drawn up. Money changed hands. On Christmas Day, 1751, Sarah Holt walked out of Riverside Plantation as a free woman, carrying a single bag of possessions and a letter explaining where to find her husband. The journey took 6 weeks, north through the Carolinas, west through the valleys, following the rivers toward the Ohio Territory. She traveled with a group of traders who'd been paid by Marcus to ensure her safe passage, men who treated her with the respect due to a customer rather than property. In February 1752, 4 years after being torn apart, Cyrus and Sarah Holt reunited at Dubois' trading post on the Ohio River. They held each other without speaking, both of them crying, both of them unable to believe that this moment was real. Around them, traders and customers pretended not to notice, giving them privacy in the only way frontier people knew how, by focusing intently on their own business. Finally, Cyrus pulled back enough to see Sarah's face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry for everything." "Stop," Sarah said, pressing her hand against his mouth. "You came for me. You bought my freedom. That's all that matters. I killed 7 men to get here." "I know. Everyone knows." She smiled through her tears. "They made you a monster in the stories, but I know better. You're just a man who loved his wife." They stayed at the trading post for 2 more weeks, then traveled further west, into territory where no one knew their names or their history. They settled in a small community of freed blacks, French traders, and friendly Indians, a place where the past mattered less than what you could contribute to the present. Cyrus built barrels. Sarah worked as a midwife, skills she'd learned during her years at Riverside. They built a small cabin, planted a garden, and lived. Not happily ever after. Life was too hard for fairy tale endings, and the memories too painful to ever fully heal, but they lived free, and in the end, that was enough. The man who had been Cyrus Holt sat on the porch of his cabin, watching autumn paint the Ohio Valley in shades of gold and crimson. He was 57 now, his hair gray, his hands still scarred but less steady than they'd once been. The cabin was modest, but well-built, surrounded by a garden that Sarah tended with the same precision he brought to barrel-making. They had survived. Against all odds, against all expectations, they had built a life in freedom. But on this particular October evening, as the anniversary of the Seven Oaks massacre arrived once again, Cyrus found himself thinking about the past, about 7 men trapped in barrels, about the weight of those barrels as he'd rolled them toward the James River, about the sound they'd made entering the water. Sarah emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 cups of tea. She sat beside him, her presence a comfort that had never diminished across 2 decades of freedom. "Thinking about it again?" she asked quietly. "Always think about it this time of year. Do you regret it?" Cyrus considered the question, as he had every year for 25 years. "I regret that it was necessary. But no, I don't regret doing it. They sold you. They treated us like tools. They built their wealth on our suffering. Someone had to say enough. 7 someones died for that statement." "And how many thousands died for their profits?" Cyrus shook his head. "I'm not saying I was right, Sarah. I'm saying I'm not sorry." They sat in silence, drinking their tea, watching the sun descend toward the horizon. "You hear the news from Boston?" Sarah asked. "They're saying there's going to be a war, the colonies against England, revolution they're calling it." "I heard. Think it'll change anything for people like us?" Cyrus snorted. "Not likely. White folks fighting other white folks over taxes and tea. Don't imagine they'll free the slaves while they're fighting for their own freedom from England. That'd require noticing the contradiction." Maybe, Sarah said, but maybe not. Contradictions have a way of becoming visible eventually. What you did, what happened at Seven Oaks, people still talk about it. Stories changed over the years, gotten bigger, gotten mixed up with other stories. But people remember that slaves can fight back. Stories don't free people. No, Sarah agreed. But they make freedom seem possible, and that's something. In Virginia, the story of Cyrus the Cooper had indeed grown in the telling. By 1773, most people had forgotten the actual facts of the case, if they'd ever known them. What remained was legend, the slave who'd killed his masters, the barrels that had floated down the James River, the cooper who'd vanished into the wilderness. Some versions said he'd been caught and hanged. Others claimed he'd died in the mountains. A few whispered that he'd made it to freedom, that he was living somewhere in the Western Territories, that he'd built a life beyond slavery's reach. The truth didn't matter as much as what the story represented. At Seven Oaks Plantation, now owned by Margaret Wickham's son, Thomas Jr., enslaved workers still told the tale to their children. Joshua had died years ago, but his apprentices carried on the story, each generation adding their own embellishments. Remember Cyrus, they'd say. Remember that no chain is permanent. Remember that there's always a choice, even when the choice costs everything. The workshop where Cyrus had worked still stood, though it had been rebuilt and renovated several times. Sometimes, late at night, workers claimed they could hear the sound of a hammer striking oak, 3 hits steady as a heartbeat. They said it was Cyrus's ghost, still working, still creating, still refusing to be forgotten. But there were no ghosts, just memory, and the stories memory creates. In Boston, as tensions mounted toward revolution, a freed black man named Marcus, no relation to Cyrus, though he'd heard the story, stood before a gathering of abolitionists. "You talk about freedom," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the room, "about liberty and natural rights, about how no man should be subject to tyranny, but you don't mention the thousands of slaves working plantations from Georgia to Virginia. How is that liberty? How is that freedom?" The white abolitionists shifted uncomfortably. Some agreed with him. Others thought he was being unreasonable, that all changes required time, that they couldn't fight 2 revolutions simultaneously. "There was a man," Marcus continued, "a cooper in Virginia, who killed 7 plantation owners and escaped to freedom. The story's famous now, though most people don't believe it actually happened. But it did happen. And you know what it proved?" The room waited. "It proved that slaves understand freedom better than you do, because we know its true cost. We know that sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything, including your life, to be truly free. You're preparing to fight England over taxes. We'd fight for the right to exist as human beings, so don't talk to me about liberty while you own slaves. Don't talk to me about natural rights while you sell children away from their mothers. Either freedom means something, or it's just another word for power." The room fell silent. Some abolitionists nodded, faces troubled by the truth they'd been avoiding. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the mirror Marcus had held up to their hypocrisy. After the meeting, an older white man approached Marcus. He was thin, scholarly-looking, with the careful posture of someone who spent his days reading and writing. "That story you mentioned," the man said, "about the cooper who killed 7 plantation owners, do you know if it's true?" "True as anything that happens in this country," Marcus replied. "Why?" "Because I've been collecting testimonies, stories from freed slaves, accounts of rebellions, documentation of resistance. I believe that someday, maybe not in our lifetime, but someday, slavery will end. And when it does, people will need to know it didn't end because masters became kind. It ended because enslaved people refused to remain enslaved." "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "Benjamin. Benjamin Rush. I'm a physician here in Philadelphia, but I also believe in documenting truth, no matter how uncomfortable." Marcus shook his hand. Then document this. The cooper's name was Cyrus Holt. He was enslaved at Seven Oaks Plantation in Virginia. On October 14th, 1748, he trapped 7 plantation owners in whiskey barrels and drowned them in the James River. Then he escaped. Some say he died in the mountains. Others say he made it to freedom in the Western Territories. Either way, he refused to die a slave. Benjamin Rush pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "Thank you," he said. "Stories like this matter. They'll matter even more in the future." Marcus nodded. "Just make sure you tell it right. Don't make him a monster. Don't make him a saint. Just tell the truth. He was a man who'd been pushed too far and who chose justice over survival." "I'll do my best," Rush promised. Back in the Ohio Valley, Cyrus and Sarah's life continued with the rhythm of quiet freedom. They had never had children. Sarah's years of hard labor at Riverside had damaged her body in ways that couldn't be repaired. But they'd built a different kind of family. Young runaway slaves sometimes found their way to the settlement, following rumors of a community that would welcome them. Cyrus and Sarah took them in, taught them trades, helped them build new lives. One evening in the spring of 1774, a young man arrived at their cabin. He was perhaps 20, exhausted from travel, his clothes torn and his feet bloody from walking. "My name's Daniel," he said when Sarah opened the door. "I ran from a plantation in Maryland. Someone told me to find Marcus Freeman, said he'd help." Cyrus, still using the name Marcus in public, stood from his workbench. He studied the young man for a moment, seeing his own desperation reflected back from decades past. "You hungry?" Cyrus asked. "Starving." "Sarah, get him some food. Daniel, come sit. Tell me your story." "Over cornbread and stew," Daniel explained. He'd been a blacksmith, skilled but treated brutally by an owner who resented his intelligence. Finally, after being beaten for supposedly speaking disrespectfully, Daniel had run. He'd traveled for 3 weeks, hiding during the day, moving at night, following the North Star and the stories other slaves had told him. "They say you killed 7 white men," Daniel said quietly. "That true?" Cyrus and Sarah exchanged a glance. "Where'd you hear that?" Cyrus asked. "Everybody knows the story, the cooper who trapped his masters in barrels. Some folks say it's just a legend, others swear it's true. I figured if I could find you, maybe you could teach me how to survive out here." Cyrus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his own hands, the hands that had built barrels and taken lives, the hands that had rolled 7 coffins into a river, the hands that had built this cabin and this life. "It's true," he finally said. "I did kill 7 men. But I'm not going to teach you how to kill, Daniel. I'm going to teach you how to live, how to make barrels so perfect that nobody questions your right to exist, how to save money and plan for the future, how to be free not just in body, but in spirit. But if someone comes for me, then you run or you fight, depending on the situation. But you don't go looking for violence. You don't let anger make your decisions. What I did, it was necessary, and I'd do it again. But it cost me 3 years of Sarah's life. 3 years we can never get back. Violence always costs more than you think." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom. "I'll teach you smithing," Cyrus continued, "or coopering if you prefer. You'll work hard, save your money, and build a life. And maybe someday, if there's war coming, like people say, maybe that war will end slavery, but until then we survive, we endure. We prove that we're human beings by living like human beings. Understand?" "I understand." "Good. Now finish your food. Tomorrow, we start work." The American Revolution came in 1775, and with it, the contradictions Marcus had spoken about became impossible to ignore. The Continental Congress spoke eloquently about freedom and natural rights while keeping slaves. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal while owning hundreds of human beings. The hypocrisy was so blatant that even some white colonists began questioning the system, but the war didn't end slavery. Instead, It complicated it. Both the British and the Americans offered freedom to slaves who fought for their side, creating a situation where enslaved people had to choose between masters rather than escaping mastery altogether. In the Ohio Valley, Cyrus and Sarah watched from a distance, neither joining the fight nor fleeing from it. They were too old for warfare, too settled for upheaval. They'd already fought their revolution years before in a workshop by the James River. News reached them occasionally through traders and travelers. George Washington was leading the Continental Army. The British had occupied New York. Fighting was brutal and inconclusive. And through it all, slavery continued, the nation's original sin persisting even as it fought for its own freedom. "They'll never understand," Cyrus said one evening, watching the sun set over the Ohio River. "Not really. They think freedom is about taxes and representation. They don't understand that real freedom means nobody can own you. Nobody can sell your wife. Nobody can work you to death and call it commerce." "Maybe their children will understand," Sarah replied. "Or their children's children. Change takes time." "We don't have time. I'm 59 years old, Sarah. You're 57. We've lived free for 25 years, but how many others are still in chains? How many Cyruses are out there, making barrels for masters who'll never see them as human?" Sarah took his hand, her grip still strong despite the years. "You can't save everyone, Cyrus. You can't fight every battle. What you did at Seven Oaks, it mattered. It changed things, even if the change is slower than we'd like. People remember. The story spreads. And every time a slave hears about the cooper who drowned his masters, they realize that resistance is possible. That's something. That's more than nothing." Cyrus squeezed her hand, acknowledging the truth of her words, even as his heart rebelled against their insufficiency. On October 14, 1778, 30 years after the massacre, Cyrus Holt died peacefully in his sleep. He was 62 years old, which was ancient for someone who'd lived through slavery and hard labor. Sarah found him in the morning, his face calm, his hands folded across his chest. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't process that after 30 years together, through separation and reunion, through violence and peace, through slavery and freedom, he was simply gone. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the Ohio River, a spot he'd chosen years earlier. The grave marker was simple: Marcus Freeman, 1716–1778, cooper, husband, free man. No mention of Cyrus Holt. No mention of Seven Oaks or the 7 barrels or the revolution he'd carried out alone. Just a free man's grave in free territory, which was exactly what he'd wanted. Sarah lived another 12 years, continuing their work of helping runaway slaves, teaching them trades, building the community they'd started. When she died in 1790, she was buried beside Cyrus, her marker reading, "Sarah Freeman, 1717–1790, midwife, wife, free woman." Their cabin became a way station for runaways, maintained by the community they'd helped build. For decades, fugitive slaves found refuge there, learned trades there, heard the story of Cyrus and Sarah there. The story changed over time, of course. Details blurred, facts merged with legend, truth became myth, but the core remained. A man who'd been enslaved had risen up, had taken justice into his own hands, had escaped to freedom and lived free until his death. It was a story of hope wrapped in violence, of love surviving separation, of human beings refusing to be treated as property regardless of the cost. Present day, the James River still flows past what was once Seven Oaks Plantation, though the plantation itself is long gone, replaced by suburban developments and shopping centers. A historical marker stands near the riverbank, commemorating the Seven Oaks incident of 1748 in carefully neutral language that avoids judgment or moral clarity. Local historians have documented what they can. Parish records confirm that 7 wealthy planters died on October 14, 1748, their bodies recovered from the river. Newspaper accounts from the period describe a vicious murder committed by an ungrateful slave. Court documents show that a reward was offered for Cyrus Holt, though no record exists of him being captured or killed. Some historians believe he died in the mountains during the manhunt. Others argue that he likely escaped to the Western Territories, possibly living under an assumed name. A few have connected Marcus Freeman of the Ohio Valley to Cyrus Holt, noting the similar timelines, the coopering skills, and the wife named Sarah. But no one can prove it definitively. The truth has been lost to time, leaving only the story, and the story has spread far beyond Virginia. It appears in collections of slave narratives, in histories of rebellion, in academic papers analyzing resistance to oppression. It's been told and retold, adapted and embellished, transformed into a legend that serves multiple purposes for multiple audiences. For some, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving slaves too much autonomy. For others, it's a celebration of resistance against injustice. For still others, it's a tragedy. 7 murders that solved nothing, changed nothing, just added more death to a system built on death. But perhaps the story's real power lies not in what actually happened, but in what it represents. The refusal to accept bondage, the willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom, the understanding that some things are worth dying for. On foggy nights along the James River, locals sometimes claim they can still see them. 7 barrels floating in the current, moving steadily toward the sea. They say if you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of fists pounding against oak, the muffled screams of men drowning in darkness. They say if you're very quiet, you might hear something else, the steady rhythm of a hammer striking wood, 3 beats like a heartbeat, the sound of a cooper still working, still creating, still refusing to be forgotten. But there are no ghosts, of course, just memory, and the river that carries memory toward the sea. Just the story of Cyrus Holt, who was born in chains but refused to die enslaved. Just the echo of 7 barrels entering the water on an October night in 1748, the splash like a toast between ghosts, the river swallowing them whole. Just the truth that freedom isn't given, it's taken, or it isn't freedom at all.